In this video I'm going to go through setting up for through dovetail joints using one of these metal dovetail templates from Cooldeep on the all-metal panther rotor. The first thing you have to do is mount the template on the plastic template holder, and that turned out to be a bit tricky because it has to go in front of these screws that hold the template holder itself. So it has to be mounted with the template holder already in place, and it has to be mounted with a few washers behind it so that the template doesn't bump up against the screw here. Make sure that the template is level by making sure that this scale here reads the same value on this side and this side, and it needs to be down far enough so that when the follower, it's a 10mm follower, is in the bottom of this slot, the rotor bit is just below the level of the table. We start with a dovetail bit, and this is a 3/4 inch wide 15-degree dovetail. And I bring that forward so it just barely doesn't hit the table, and the stop down here, make sure it doesn't go any further. And to cut the tails, we need to make sure we don't plunge. So I'm going to set the other stop right up against it so that the carriage can't move. I marked on here how deep I want to cut. So I'm going to put this in here and line that up with the tip of the bit and lock it down. Now I'm still figuring this out myself, and that first cut didn't go so well. First of all, I've got a lot of burning in here because this hard maple and the dovetail bit having to cut full depth as once is a bit of a problem. The other problem is as it cuts, the bit spins this way and it pulls the wood this way, and unless I really tighten these clamps, it always pulls it away from the fence. So I'm going to move that fence to the other side. To cut down on the burning a bit, I'm just marking where the rotor bit's going to cut, and I'll remove the bulk of the material in the bandsaw. No burning this time, and I didn't have to cringe while I was cutting. So now I need to switch to a straight bit for cutting the pins, and that one only has a 1/4 inch shank, so I have to swap out the whole collet. So I'm only setting this up to do a really shallow cut because it's not going to fit right for the first time anyways. And this time around I'm going to go down the V's with the followers, whereas before I was going down the straight ones. So let's see how that fits. I have quite a bit of slack here. If it's too tight, you need to move the template down. If it's too loose, it needs to be moved up, and just guesstimating, holding a caliper next to it, I'd say the slot is about this size, which is 1.7mm. So to tighten that up, I need to move all the cuts here up by about 1.7mm, which means the template needs to move up twice as far. So that template needs to come up about 3.5mm. So looking on the scale here, it's at 2.5 right now. So I need to set that to about 6 on both sides. And here's an oopsie. The stock ended up slipping on me just a bit. Let's play that again. But I cut the rest of that joint anyways. That makes for a very snug fit. So I think I'll go with that. I ended up cutting this joint more than once. The biggest problem I ran into is that the stock would get pushed this way sometimes for some of the cuts, And the way I eliminated this is to make an auxiliary little stop right here that clamps on there. And this is just a T-slot bolt that fits into the slots and a little knob. So let's see how this fits. Not too bad. There's a very tiny gap right here. And that I've established is because this piece of wood is not entirely flat on the bottom, so it didn't quite sit flat on the table. So that's also very important. Make sure it sits flat on the table so you don't get gaps. So like any dovetail cutting jig, this one's a bit of a pain in the ass to set up. But here's a cool thing about this one. Suppose you want to vary the thickness of the stock. If you want to make this part a bit thicker, the only change really is that you have to cut this one a bit deeper, and there's no change in the setup for that. And if you want to make this part thicker, it just grows in this direction. And since this surface is the one on the table, like so, when you cut it, it doesn't matter how thick that is, it won't change how the bottom of these fit into the other thing. So basically, once you got the right height for this one figured out for whichever bits you're using, you don't need to change it even if you change the thickness of material. So notice I'm now wearing a different shirt and my hair is a tiny bit longer. That's because 2 weeks have passed since I shot the last bit of the video. When I showed what I'd shot so far to Kuldeep, he pointed out that the way to fasten this template holder with this one on here is with these screws to go in here, and that prevents that bar from sliding up and down. And that way you don't need these screws anymore and you don't need the spacer in here. So let's change that over. This is still an earlier version of the template holder, and the brass bars on here don't fit as precisely as on the new template holder, so he sent me some parts to upgrade this one. So there's a plastic spacer in here, and that's not as precise as these little spacers in this bag. So there's 3 that's supposed to go on here, and the bar, and he sent a new bar as well. This one's slightly inaccurate, so here's a new one. So I loosened these a little bit, and now the tricky part is getting this in here. They need to be exactly lined up for this to slide down. With the top of the template holder flush on here, I can tighten these screws and it'll put them in the right position. And now with the screws tightened in there, this slides up and down very parallel, so there's less fiddling with checking the scales on either side. And now with no longer any screws in these slots, I can just put that dovetail template on without the need for a spacer behind it. Kuldeep has also asked me to point out, while this is a template with 32mm spacing, that is, every dovetail to the next is 32mm, he's also got one that makes dovetails with 1-inch spacings. So these are actually 2 inches on here because it reduces. You can only use this one for thinner stock, because for through dovetails you can't get a bit that's small enough for these and still cuts through 3/4 inch stock. But for 1/2 inch stock it's good. And he's also got a box joint template. This one has got fingers every inch. So if you go down every inch, you can make 1/4 inch finger joints. Or if you go down every other one, you can make 1/2 inch finger joints.